So first, I just want to take just a few minutes to introduce the panel, and let me just encourage everybody to fully investigate all of our panelists. I'm going to give like a very brief biography, but all of our panelists are very accomplished and are very great leaders in the community. So I hope you can get to know more about them besides just the couple sentences I have time to say tonight. But first I want to introduce Congresswoman Grace Meng, Congresswoman from New York City, Queens, who was the first Asian American to represent the state of New York. And I just want to say thank you actually for helping to lead the charge in passing the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which is a bipartisan bill that Congresswoman Meng led that was recently signed into law. So thank you so much for your leadership on that, and thank you for being here. Next, I want to introduce State Senator Stephanie Chang. You can see the city that she represents in her background, Detroit, Michigan. Steph was the first Asian American woman to be elected to the Michigan legislature, first as a member of the House and now currently serves in the Senate. She's also the co-founder of the APA Legislative Caucus there. And in addition to that, before she became a legislator, was a great leader in Michigan, helping to co-found APIA Vote, and also Rising Voices of Asian American Families, and formerly worked closely with Grace Lee Boggs, another great Asian American female leader. Next, I want to introduce Councilwoman Lynn Song, a longtime Ann Arbor resident who currently represents the city of Ann Arbor. Prior to that, she worked with the Ann Arbor Public Schools Educational Foundation and also worked with national organizations on ethical adoptions. Next, I want to introduce Roland Huang, who is both an attorney and a lecturer currently in University of Michigan's American Culture Program, who I know many of us are alumni of, in the API Studies program, and also currently works with a number of organizations, including American Citizens for Justice, OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, as well as the Michigan Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I think is one of a couple members on this panel that might have double degrees from University of Michigan, more than one. And last but not least, I want to introduce Palak Sheth, who is the public policy manager at Instagram, where she also is the overall lead for the Asian Pacific Islander Americans at Instagram Resource Group, and is also the co-chair of the American Constitution Society's Bay Area Lawyer Chapter. So thanks for all the panelists for joining us today. I'm excited to hear your thoughts. And again, thanks for all the attendees for joining us. So I'm going to get us into the first question. And obviously, I think, holding this panel is coming at a very important time for the community. I've been saying a lot, it's a really interesting time to be an Asian American. And I think some people are just learning about anti-Asian racism in America and think it's a new phenomenon. So I want to ask Roland, can you talk about, what do you think? Is that true? Is that not? What's your opinion on that?
Oh, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Charmaine, for all your leadership, and thank you to all the new board members and committee members. So congratulations on this first annual meeting. In terms of the question, is anti-Asian racism new? I think we all have to embrace our presence as Asian Americans in American history and realize our part in that history. And so when you learn about the Asian American experience, it includes the building of the railroads in 1865 to 1869, and the gold rush, and the trauma that occurred to Asians after that. With the economic downturn, there were lynchings in LA, in Spokane, in various Chinatowns around the country in the 1870s. And there was certainly anti-Asian racism that led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 by Congress, certainly driven by a racist agenda. And then we can't forget the incarceration of Japanese Americans. There was, hysteria during World War II, very much, anti-racist, racist sentiment during World War II. And the 1982 killing of Vincent Chin when Mr. Evans said because of MFs were out of work, a targeted killing of a Chinese American in 1982 that led to 2 civil rights cases. And of course, we have 2019, 2020, and 2021, all of the 6,600 incidents, a lot of it triggered, I think, by the racist rhetoric of Mr. Trump calling the COVID-19 flu, the Kung flu, the Wuhan flu. And so, underlying all of this is the anti-Asian sentiment that ebbs and flows throughout time. You can tag these sentiments to particular events over time, but the underlying anti-racist sentiment is there all the time, just it ebbs and flows. But I think that's, the Asian American experience is rife with a lot of experiences of anti-Asian incidents and behavior. So that's my view of it. And that's what we lecture on, in the American Culture AAPI Studies program. And, I urge everyone to, visit history and understand that Asian Americans have been missing in history. And, the stories deserve to be told.
Well, as a lecturer, do you have any recommended readings, I wonder, for the group to help folks learn about the history?
Well, certainly, Paula Yu just came out with a book, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, which is a very good definitive work. Thank you, Lynn. It is really a good compendium about the Vincent Chin case, about him and the trial, and all of the key players during the trial. So I urge that as a good reading. Of course, Erica Lee, her book, Making of Asian America, is a wonderful book. Several of the American culture courses have that as the foundation text. So those are just a couple.
Thank you. Yes, I'm reading Erica Lee's book now. It was not published yet when I was a student, but it's been a great read so far.
Sure.
And maybe possibly also a recommendation if anyone doesn't love reading. Just there are a few people there. I think those PBS series on Asian Americans is quite good. I don't know if you agree with that, Roland, or not, but possibly a recommendation. Great. Thank you so much.
And I think it's viewable free.
Yes, it is.
This month.
Yeah. So thank you. You mentioned Vincent Chin, and this kind of brings me to that next question that I have is, it wasn't considered a hate crime, what happened with Vincent Chin. And even today, a lot of people ask, well, what was it really a hate crime? In reference to the Atlanta shootings and other incidents of the AAPI targeted violence. So Rep. Meng, do you think you can kind of talk about this a little bit?
Hi, everyone. First, I too want to congratulate Charmaine and the new board. So exciting and so proud to see what you've accomplished in quite a short time. And I think it really will have a long-lasting impact way beyond the pandemic. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be helpful in the future. It's always great to be with fellow Wolverines and the Michigan family. One of the reasons why we wrote and passed that legislation was because there really isn't enough data and statistics. We don't really have a complete enough picture of what's going on around the country. And sure, we might, know of some of the more recent cases, especially if there was a video. But as with any other sort of public health crisis like gun violence, we need to have more statistics so we can see what's happening, where it's happening, and what are the patterns. And hate crimes themselves are often difficult to prove. Most of the cases that have been reported, even this past year, are more hate incidents, bias incidents, and might not necessarily be proven as a crime. However, before we can even have the experts determine that, we need to make sure that law enforcement is doing due diligence in investigating. And as we saw in Atlanta, Georgia, the sheriff initially just chalked it up to, the gunman having a bad day. And people from our community spoke up, people in Georgia spoke up and said, no, that's not an effective investigation. He wasn't just having a bad day. And I was able to travel to Georgia with some of the other Asian Congress members, right after the tragedies happened. We met with the families of the victim, and we literally drove the same path from point A to point B and C, which are across the street from each other. The drive took almost an hour during non-traffic times, non-rush hour. The second and third locations were way off the highway. It would be really hard to end up, coincidentally or by accident in those locations. And everyone locally from Georgia was telling me that that's not really a common path. There's very little reason you would go from one county to the other. And there were many, many other similar businesses not owned by Asian Americans in between. And so, we all know Asian American women are uniquely vulnerable to that intersection of racism and misogyny that has really existed a long, long time in this country. And people who don't know our history don't realize that that intersection exists. Many Asian Americans ourselves don't talk enough about it. And so, we talk about the history of how Asian women were scapegoated as a moral threat, barred from entering the US under the first anti-immigrant law, the Page Act, which I think we talked about. And so people have intention, even if their words are not able to be explicitly categorized as hate. Someone yelling the words, go back, to an Asian man just walking down the street might not seem to someone on the outside looking in like a hateful sentiment, but our community truly knows the intent and the implication of those words. And so that's why legislation like the ones we passed are important to get a clearer picture, but also the importance of learning about AAPI history in order to at least reveal the history of this intersection of racism and misogyny.
Thank you for that. And just wondering really quickly if Roland, you had any additional thoughts to that from as a lawyer in that sort of sense of what you've seen, especially as the co-founder of American Citizens for Justice.
It's important for the community to be diligent about tracking what happens in cases and watch what law enforcement does in terms of investigation. In the Vincent Chin case, Detective Roberts did not go, he just called the Fancy Pants where the Vincent Chin incident started, but he never got a response. He didn't get a phone call back, so he just dropped it. And that was part of the problem with that case, because the evidence about, racial epithets at the Fancy Pants would have been, key information at the start. And the same thing happens, I guess, in, Atlanta, where it doesn't seem like a lot of effort is being put into figuring out whether it is a, racial motivated hate crime as opposed to merely a killing and a shooting. And so thank God the case involved Fulton County as well as Cherokee County, but it's something that bears watching in case after case. I mean, you can also talk about the Fong Lee case and how, everything was stacked in favor of the police officers in terms of whether or not there was any reason to shoot Fong Lee in Minneapolis, as opposed to, the presumption that he was carrying a gun as opposed to something else. So many, many cases of perhaps police malfeasance in terms of investigation.
Thank you for that, Roland. I do want to get one more question into our Congresswoman before I know she has to leave a little bit earlier from the panel, but wanted to ask the next question. I think you mentioned, I think there's kind of a evolution in some folks in our community and what they're feeling compelled to speak up about. I'm curious, how have you seen the Asian American identity evolve over time?
Yeah, I feel like, look, this past year and a half has been really painful for our community. I think so many tears have been shed amongst people we know, family, friends, and amongst strangers. Our community nationwide has gotten stronger. I think it's more unified, and I think we're more strategic. The truth is, like, I really struggle with whether we've become more vocal, because we've literally been shouting the same things at least over the past year and a half. Like, the things we're saying, the Zooms that we're having, I mean, maybe more people are inviting us that aren't Asian, but we've been saying the same things. It's just that people haven't really been listening to us, right? And what I really do think that we are at an inflection point, and over this past year and a half, and I think part of it started from a lot of the Black Lives Matters protests that happened last summer, and when a lot of Asian Americans participated, and many had, maybe for the first time, conversations with their own family and their own networks about why Asian Americans were at these protests. And I think that the Black community and other communities who've stood with us this whole time have really, like, strengthened our muscles and vocabulary of advocacy. And that certainly was the case as various communities banded together and helped increase the Asian voter turnout last year, which I think increased over 300% compared to the last presidential election in 2016. And so I think we've grown so much in the last year and a half, the last 2 years, and we still have so much to do. But I just want to, focus and be very hopeful about the coalitions that have been built and that have been strengthened. I mean, this show of solidarity, all of us together, we are really making history. Our parents and grandparents, who might have been that first generation of immigrants, didn't necessarily have the tools to do that sort of outreach, but we do. And so I'm really hopeful.
Yes, I think I'm also very hopeful. Would love to get another perspective on that same question. Maybe Lynn, how have you seen the Asian American identity evolve over time?
I mean, for myself personally, I grew up really identifying as Vietnamese American. My parents are refugees from Vietnam and Laos. So my racial and ethnic identity, I felt, was always tied to my parents and their immigration history. And then as I grew older, I came to U of M, it became more political, more informed with history. And then also giving me, I think, an opportunity to think back about the things that we experience as a family and how that connects with the greater Asian American experience. I grew up in Dearborn. So when Vincent Chin was murdered, I distinctly remember my mother cutting out his picture from the newspaper and saying, your dad looks just like this man. And my father having to wear he had just landed a job at Ford Motor Company after arriving here on the fall of Saigon and working as a janitor, working through school. And his first professional job was at Ford. And his colleagues told him, if you want to be safe, you need to wear your Ford badge wherever you go. So I think that was an early lesson on the dangers and the violence that are committed against people who look like us, who identify as Asian, and the perception that we're threats and unwanted. And of all things, to have a Ford, an employee badge to signify your allegiance, right, to some kind of ideal. I'm a parent now. I have a 10 and 15-year-old, so the conversations have really changed, especially in the past 4 years. I ran for my first office as a library trustee here in Ann Arbor in 2016. I figured if Hillary Clinton was running, I could run too. I thought it would be totally easy, but the conversations have been more difficult over the past years and become more political in explaining and really trying to push and having these conversations with extended family too. Vietnamese Americans are pretty conservative, but in 2016 came a group called Pivot, Progressive Vietnamese Americans, really trying to support more progressive action, more progressive candidates, and you see that with and you see a number of Vietnamese Americans running across the country in different state legislatures. and that's, I hope that's a new point of reference for my children, where I can say, when you think about Asian Americans, you can think about people who are really trying to change and inform the country. And it's not just on the foods we eat or the holidays or cultural practices that we have individually, but as a community that's united in fighting for our rights and our place in government and in history.
I'm sure Charmaine will appreciate that. I will say out loud that although this is a nonpartisan event, I think like having more Asian American representation in elected office is an important part for the community. So also just want to say thanks to those of you on this call that decided to take the plunge and run for office and help to be leaders. So.
Yeah, no, I 100% absolutely agree. I think in general, if we could have more representation across all the different things, like, that'd be really great. And to be able to, growing up, you didn't really see a lot of people that looked like, at least I didn't see a lot of people that looked like me really anywhere, right? In Hollywood and politics. And I think that affects you growing up, right? But I think that this new generation is going to start seeing something different. And I'm really proud to be part of that. And I keep encouraging everyone to continue that, So actually, that actually kind of brings me, to something earlier that we talked about, the Black Lives Matter movement, and how a lot of Asian Americans and Asians even, participate in it, not just those who identified as Asian Americans. And so, this question is for Stephanie. How do you think anti-Asian in America racism fits into this broader narrative of racism in America?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and so excited to be part of this panel. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of it. So, this year has been rough for a lot of people in a lot of ways, and I definitely think that I really resonated with what Congresswoman Meng was saying about how people are going to the protests now. We're seeing more people like crossing lines and really showing up for one another physically, which is great. And at the same time, one of the most, and I think that the Congresswoman will probably agree too, because I know we've chatted about this before, one of the most annoying things that I have had to deal with is, and I'm sure others have as well, is in response to, talking about anti-Asian hate, is unfortunately, folk on the right have been very effective at getting this message out, where the first comments that I get from trolls on my page are, oh, did you know that a certain percentage of the folks who are doing these attacks are African American, which is actually not true, and is also very much designed to drive a wedge between Asian American and Black folks, which is so frustrating to me, and it's just honestly infuriating. So I think that, but this is not new, right? We're so used to, as Asian Americans, being used as a wedge, or being the efforts to try to divide us from other communities of color. This happens with affirmative action. This happens with other issues as well. And so I think that this is a really complicated question of how do we make sure that as we're addressing anti-Asian hate, talk about the impact on our community, but also talk about how our fates are very much intertwined with the fates of other communities of color, and how we have such a shared history, although it's very distinct. There's a lot of shared history. In my background is downtown Detroit, and on one side you've got I-375, which is a freeway that was built through Black Bottom. It destroyed a community in order to build a freeway to the suburbs. And on the other side is the Lodge Freeway, which many people don't know was actually built through the first Chinatown in Detroit. And so right there, we've got that shared history of two communities that literally were overrun by freeways. And a lot of people don't know that. So we've got to learn more about that. But I also think another example is really, thinking back over the past 4 years during the Trump administration in particular, we know that hate crimes were on the rise against just all the different communities. We know that hate crimes against Black folks, or against LGBT folks, against Jewish people, against Asian, everyone, we just saw such a huge rise in this type of sentiment. And we also know very much, thinking back to 9/11, which, 20 years ago now, which is, I remember that was actually my freshman year in college, and doesn't seem like that long ago, but anyway, it was 20 years ago. The shared, experience of South Asians, Muslims, Arabs that experience much of the same type of hate that East Asian folks are experiencing now. So I think there's so much connection that's there. And then I wanted to go back to something that Roland mentioned earlier, with the example of Fong Lee here in Michigan. I'm trying to think, I think it was maybe 14 years ago, there was a Hmong teenager that also was shot here by the police in his home, on just laying down, and it's it sparked a lot of outrage and a lot of organizing here in Michigan. So these are just a few examples, but I think that, again, it's such a complicated thing because we are so often used as a wedge. There's so much of an attempt to try to divide us, when in fact, there is very much a shared history of shared struggles, connected struggles, and also a lot of solidarity of working together. So hopefully we can continue to build more of that.
Awesome. And I'm so glad you mentioned, I was just trying to find the link to see if we could drop it in the chat, but I'm going to, thank you, Congresswoman. Thanks so much for joining. There was, per what you were saying, Steph, about who's actually being identified as the perpetrators of these hate crimes, and I'm just going to read it from my phone, but the good old University of Michigan actually put out a study recently that I think was just, went around the news. It was on NPR, and I'm just going to read it here. There's a misconception, and actually, that 90% of the perpetrators of anti-Asian hate and violence that were reported in the news last year were, sorry, I'm saying it a little backwards. Basically, perpetrators of hate crimes are largely white people, and the things that get put in the news are usually Black attackers. So it's creating this misconception that it's all kind of Black and Asian crime, but it's actually a very different story. So at some point, I'll find the article and drop it in the chat so folks can read it. But I want to actually ask a group question, and this is also for our participants, our attendees, if you want to put it in the chat as well. I'm going to start with Pollock, but one question just for everybody would be, what are some misconceptions about Asian Americans that you wish people knew more about? So I want to go around and ask everybody that question, but also attendees out there, put it in the chat so we can see as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jen, for sending that question over to me, and just wanted to echo what everybody else already said about Charmaine. Like, huge applause to you. I think when I think of Michigan people, I often think that they were just natural born leaders, and that just is something that you really exemplify with starting this group. So thank you for that. What isn't a misconception about the AAPI community? I think even among AAPIs, we often have misconceptions about each other's communities. I want to go back to something that was said earlier, which is that, we are not a monolith. It is challenging for any of us that have ever organized this community to actually attempt to be inclusive of all of the different identities and groups that are encompassed within AAPI. And when we talk about the connections, oftentimes some of those are cultural connections. Oftentimes they're immigrant stories that connect us and connect our identities. But that isn't the same across all of the folks that come from Asia, as well as the folks that come from the Pacific Islanders. And I think what I would want for people to know is that we're not interchangeable. That, not every person that's brown that is from Asia is Indian. That there are 5 different South Asian countries, that not everyone that looks East Asian is Chinese. We are not interchangeable, and each of us have very rich, very old cultures. And to really dig in and to start identifying the differences between each of our cultures, not in an effort to not contribute to like the group that we are and the the cohort that we are as a whole, and but to understand what comes from each of our cultures so that we can acknowledge the communities and the people behind them, and really just try to build a little bit more of a characteristic around each and every different API community. I would also say that another misconception, I think of this both in school, but I think about this in all platforms that I've seen, is that Asians are, not vocal. I think we were talking about this earlier, that we're not going to advocate for ourselves. And I just really, really, really want to combat that. I think it makes it more challenging than it needs to be. We may, first of all, we don't have the same leadership style. We don't have the same way of reacting or responding to moments of crises. Stephanie brought up that 20 years ago, hard to believe, was 9/11. And I think in the immediate aftermath of that, the community that I identify with was experiencing a rise in hate. I often say that in this immediate moment, I personally feel like both a bystander as well as someone who identifies as API, because the truth of the matter is that elders in my community are not the ones being targeted right now. And so I very much feel a deep sense of allyship and a need to be both a bystander and truly an upstander of my fellow APIs and their communities. But when I think about, the misconception, I often think that we ourselves sometimes kind of perpetuate this thought that Asians are not vocal, or that we don't organize, or that we may not advocate for ourselves and be like as strong as other communities are. And I just really want to question where that's come from. We spoke earlier, Roland mentioned historically many of the different incidences of hate in history that APIs have experienced here in the US. And we haven't, the education around the API, the Asian and API influence in civil rights movements in these aftermaths of crisis moments has not been well documented. The influence and coverage of APIs in the shaping of the culture in this country has not been well documented. I think somebody mentioned the PBS like short series about Asians. And I think that did a great job of actually focusing on our impact on culture in the US, because I just think that we don't, in formal school settings, in media, in Hollywood, anywhere, really focus on the influence of this community and how it's actually shaped this country. So I would both ask for us as a community to stop perpetuating what I think are misconceptions that are often just kind of laziness of the mind, that people, tend to say things that we're not vocal, we're meek, this, that, and the other. When in fact, we've been at the forefront of civil rights movements as allies for other communities. We've been pushing our own efforts, both in policy landscapes in DC. There are amazing civil rights coalitions and organizations that are upwards of 30 years old. I think the Asian Americans Advancing Justice is 30 years old this year. Somebody earlier had said our influence in politics our influence in the election this past year, we're, I believe, 23 million now of the US population. We're the fastest growing race-based category in the US. There is power in our community, and I think we need to acknowledge that more.
Thank you so much, Paula. There's a couple people actually submitted things similar to what you said. I think Carrie and Morgan saying, there's vast differences between the different, countries of origin, and even within countries like, China, India, and, even within that, there can be regional differences and cultural differences that people also might not appreciate. So I also want to say hello, Professor Lawson, who just put a message in the chat, also formerly, of the API Studies program. So thank you so much for being here. Other panelists, any thoughts on misconceptions you wish people didn't have or knew more about?
Can I venture an opinion? That being that Asian Americans are targeted just for looking different. I think acting on the perpetrator's view that we're perpetual foreigners. And the fact of the matter is we have to explain that we are Americans. We may be Japanese American, Chinese American, Korean American, Filipino American, whatever. We're all American. And while we're celebrating during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month our various different heritages, we are all American and we are loyal to America. And so there's a distinction between celebrating our cultural heritages, but there's no question about our loyalty to America. And I think that needs to be explained.
Thank you. You know, actually, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to tack this on. I just saw this message from talking about the disparity amongst Asians and the whole model minority myth. You know, and that's one thing for me that is that misconception to me. It's a huge myth, and everything that everybody has said either in the chat or, you know, what Pollock said, you know, what Roland has said kind of ties into that a little bit as well. And I was just wondering if anyone on the panel would like to sort of address that, that question or that thought.
The model minority myth is, I talk about this with my children too. You know, I have expectations for them, but they're so different from what I had as firstborn in this country from my parents. And, you know, for a lot of Asian American youth that I see, you know, the peers for my teenagers, especially the pressure, the mental anguish for trying to somehow meet the model minority myth has, you know, there are kids who are, you know, depressed and struggling, and it's just so, it's unfortunate when we hear that this myth is perpetuated by, you know, within our own community and, you know, within the school systems too. I wanted to say, like, if we could talk about disaggregation of our the data that's collected on our community and on how we should push for this. As a Southeast Asian, I used to volunteer with the Healthy Asian Americans Project at the university and advocated for cervical cancer screenings for Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian Americans, because we have the highest incidence of cervical cancer of any ethnic minority. And people are amazed to hear that there are barriers to access quality health care or translators, and the rates of poverty, rates of college attainment, language issues within different ethnic minority communities. And they're not too dissimilar from what we see across other communities. And we just kind of assume that, I remember meeting other Asian Americans who've been here who had different immigration experiences. And I had to explain that, you know, my parents are very traumatized from escaping the day that Saigon fell and my mother was in a refugee camp or had to escape under gunfire from Thai border guards, right? So it wasn't really a choice to come here. It wasn't a choice to immigrate here for an American dream. It was a forced choice. And no, it wasn't a choice. It was forced, and it was aggravated by, you know, geopolitics. And so yeah, I think there's a need for figuring out the differences in our immigration stories, the need to figure out what the needs are, or the continuing needs are in our community, and then just fighting that model minority myth the best that we can.
Yeah, I was just going to add, Lynn, I think that's a great point. And I actually think that even when we do all of this analysis on the elections and things, like there are, you know, ALDEF is another great organization that does try to break it down by communities. And it does highlight the cultural differences in our communities that lend itself to our political differences in the political spectrum among APIs. So I'm glad that you raised that. Going back to the question about model myth minority, I think it's a major, it's something that we have to educate our community on first and foremost, and really make sure that we're doing a better job of not aligning ourselves with this, the kind of like whiteness of what I think was systemically you know, bound to this model minority myth. I believe 12% of APIs are in the US are underneath the poverty line. In cities like New York, 25% of Asians and Asian Americans are underneath the poverty line. That is a quarter of the community in New York City. That is a huge number to be wrapped up into this idea that we are, as a conglomerate, this model minority. I think, I'm sure that Roland can speak to this better than I can, in terms of historically why we were kind of scapegoated as this community that if you study well, you can advance and you can achieve the American dream. You don't have to be, white. Look at this model minority that's able to do it. And we're pitted against the Black community. And I think for some of us, and I'm only going to speak on behalf of my community and my experience, I think that we didn't frankly realize that and bought into this idea as well, and bought into this idea to also kind of that allowed us as a community to separate ourselves from some of the Black and brown communities that had existed here that didn't have the same sort of model myth minority characteristic attributed to them. And I think that one of the things that I'm learning, I myself am on this journey and learning over this last year, is how the civil rights movement, the Immigration Nationalization Act, and things like that has changed how we were able to enter this country, why we were able to enter this country, and why it has been all under this guise of white supremacy, truly, that we continue to have this model myth minority in existence. And so the more that we can educate ourselves, and I think, just speaking on behalf of myself, educate ourselves first and then educate within our communities intergenerationally, that this is something that actually does not signify us as a culture, us as a community, but is actually part of a larger white supremacy, systemic racism issue, the more that we can do to dispel that. And Lynn, I think you had mentioned that you have this conversation with your kids. I think we need to culturally showcase in media and Hollywood and everywhere Asians representing all different types of characters. So we're not just playing the doctors in shows, and we're not just playing these, roles that perpetuate the model minority myth.
And actually, Viet Nguyen, a Pulitzer Prize winner, in his lectures, he talks about refugees and immigrants having the equal right to be mediocre, just like every other American.
And I think that's so important because, in thinking about, well, my kids are much younger than yours, but, as they're just now starting school, one of the things that I really worry about is our students have, like you said, having to sort of live up to, or pressure, the pressure to feel, to fulfill what the expectations are. And I think that there's also very much the case that there are probably a lot of Asian American students that get overlooked in terms of what help they need in school. My daughter, I'm still figuring this out right now, but she's got a lot of struggles with reading. I haven't officially gotten her diagnosed for dyslexia, but we're working on figuring it out. And I am, I don't know, stereotypes are at play here, and she's also mixed. But anyway, but I do think that there's very much a worry that I have about our kids not getting the help that they need because teachers just may have this perception that they don't need any help. But the point that I was thinking about earlier, actually, Lynn, as you were talking, and also you, Pollock, is that we have even newer Asian refugee communities in Michigan, in not just Battle Creek, in West Michigan, but in Sault Ste. Marie, and places where there's really not a lot of other Asian Americans, and we've got to probably figure out better ways of making sure that we're lifting them up and figuring out how we can better support. That's something that I know that I need to do a better job of, because we've got, that are literally, here just recently in the past few years. And I worry that, are they getting the assistance that they need? And how, especially as we go forward in the next 5-10 years, how do we make sure that we're not leaving folks out? And Pollock, I totally agree that sometimes within our community, we buy into the model minority myth. I can't tell you how many events or panels with other Asian Americans where someone will literally say Asian Americans are higher educated. And then I just shake my head because, we aren't a monolith, and we have to try to combat that model minority myth on every chance we get. And the more we perpetuate it, the more problematic it becomes. So totally agree.
The problem is with data aggregation, where, if you just read the top line of the data, Asian Americans are doing well compared to white Americans. But the fact of the matter is, the community survey is flawed by not disaggregating the data like Pew Research did, which shows the Asian American population gap between the top decile and the bottom decile is bigger than any other group, Black, Latino, white, etc. And that is the real data that shows how complex our community is. And I can also lay part of the blame on this model minority myth on the government because of its immigration policies that cherry pick the people that come into the country. If you have a PhD or if you have $1 million and create 5 jobs, then yeah, you can come in. But if you're, a middle, tier wage earner or someone that doesn't have a special skill, you're in a different category. And so certainly American immigration policy is to blame for a lot of that model minority myth.
Yeah, I have to agree with everything everyone has said. But I also feel, though, that this model minority is a really is a way to separate us from solidarity with, other people of color, and I think it's interesting too how it can affect people who are maybe Asian American, born here, raised here, versus those who are just immigrating here now. There is that difference in understanding, of not understanding maybe the history of the Black community that helped the civil rights movement, that helped us, right? I think there's also that misunderstanding. Well, I just got here. I want to play nice. I want to follow this model minority. I want to be that, because we don't want to be treated. We see how other people are being treated. So I very much also see this as a way to keep us down and keep us away from other groups as well. Because if you keep separating us, that's how we're never gonna, because racism is the root of all this, right? Racism is in very different forms of how it's treated in each community. But at the end of the day, the root is racism. And we're never going to be able to fight against that if those who are being mistreated are separated. And some people call it white supremacy. I call it white terrorism, to be honest, because it is. It's still this fear, and it sort of leads me to this next question. I know for me, besides the impact of COVID, but just this I have fear sometimes walking down the streets of San Francisco. I've been called a lot of things recently, way more than I have in the time of my life. And I would say that this has really heightened the fears among the Asian American Pacific Islander. We talk a lot about it at where I work, and it's created a lot of stress and tension. So there's also this, so in our community, there's also this stigma about mental health. And I wanted to bring it up because it is also Mental Health Awareness Month. Do all of you have recommendations for dealing with these mental health issues during this stressful time? And, anyone who wants to go first or go.
So I married into a family of mental health practitioners. My mother-in-law is a psychologist. My sister-in-law is a psychiatrist. She helped organize a mental health line for physicians during the pandemic. So I got free advice, and I'm a social worker, but I'm a policy social worker. I'm not a mental health social worker. So I try to get as much free advice as possible. So I guess there's a couple of things. Here in Ann Arbor, after the Atlanta massacre, I just organized about 25 Asian American women that I knew in different ways, casually, or women that I had chased down in a local supermarket at some point, at some time, or friends of my children, my children's friends, parents. And we started just getting together every Sunday with an open Zoom session. A lot of the women work in DEI at the university or for their corporate jobs, but there was really a need for just some space to process what's been happening, and not have to, with people who can easily empathize. And we've been doing this for, I guess, about 2 months now, and have been just trying to talk through our own experiences. You know, we're just providing support and therapy to each other in a really casual but consistent way. And it's been really nice because now that most of us are vaccinated, we're looking forward to, we've talked about food a lot. So we're getting ready for a potluck at a park in a couple of weeks. But yes, you can come. Stephanie, bring your girls. So I hope I've been encouraging folks to seek professional help. You know, if you know, the pandemic's been really, really difficult for folks. There are BIPOC mental health providers that you can reach out to. And it's been great because now that there's telehealth is more immediately readily available, you don't have to find someone, you know, especially if you're in a less diverse community, you know, you're able to access folks, you know, online. And then, you know, find the community, even if it's not, you know, just within your ethnic community, within your church. I think if we think more expansively about who can support us, and just grow your own kind of family in a way. You know, we've been calling ourselves the Ann Arbor is shortened as A2 or A squared. So we've been calling ourselves the A2 Asian aunties. And so we're like the aunties that we want for ourselves and then the aunties that we want for our children. And sometimes you just have to make the network, even when the network is, you know, the group, even if it doesn't already exist. And it's given some relief, and it actually spurred some action too. The women came together and wrote a letter to the superintendent asking for a better AAPI curriculum, advocated at the state level with Senator Chang for better AAPI curriculum, modeling things that are happening in other states. They're now on parent advisory boards. Asian aunties are fierce. So we need to tap into all of them as soon as possible.
Can I build on what Lynn just mentioned? There's been an opportunity this year during COVID with the development of so many more employee resource groups that are derived from the Asian American employees, including General Motors and TCF and US Steel and Alex Partners. There's just a whole bunch of new Asian American resource groups that are rising to meet the challenge, that they are creating a collective voice within their own organizations. And I think that's a positive thing coming out of the COVID pandemic.
I want to ask a question about what can we do as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to break out of kind of all of these cycles and you know, be heard and all that, and what are you doing personally? I do just want to make a plug though as an action. This issue of data disaggregation for the community, I think, is very important. And if somewhere in your jobs that's something that you can voice an opinion on and advocate for, I highly encourage it. I'll just use an example from the work that I am doing on Made to Save, which is a vaccine equity campaign. Even in the story of the pandemic, I think the narrative that Asian Americans are doing fine, you know, is out there in terms of like, oh, well, you know, they're not really getting COVID or whatever, but actually because of data disaggregation, it's really hard to tell the story with the numbers. There's only 16 states that are actually tracking Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians separately, but in those states, in the vast majority of them, those communities actually have a higher mortality rate than any other racial group. So you can imagine if those actually being tracked in all 50 states, what would the numbers tell? And of course, that's without even telling the kind of second pandemic that we are experiencing through anti-Asian racism. But so if somewhere in your jobs, in your lives, you can advocate for the disaggregation of data for our communities, that is one concrete action that you can take. So again, I just want to pose the question, what can we do to break out of this cycle? What are you doing personally? Lynn, I'd love to hear you talk about like advocating for more Asian American history and curriculum. I think that's great. I know we had a couple of book recommendations and TV shows, but what are other actions people are taking?
Well, I would love, so, and apologies for all of the child action that was just going on right here, and I got drawn on just now, but you know, one thing that I've been working on, it's not totally done yet, but it's trying to get some more money in our state budget for outreach at our Michigan Department of Civil Rights to do Know Your Rights outreach. around discrimination and hate incidents and hate crimes, because going back to what all the other folks have said already, is that so many in our community don't report or don't even know, what is discrimination? What is a hate incident? Is what happened to me something that I should report? So I think that's super important. And then, in working on trying to advocate for Asian American history to be taught in our curriculum, that is going to be a massive uphill battle in the current makeup of our state legislature. But meanwhile, trying to help other folks advocate at the school board level is something that I definitely want to invest some time in. There was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. So, but yeah, no, and I think that this is great. I love the Fierce Asian Aunties. Because you're so right, Lynn. I mean, they're just so, I think what's been really inspiring though has been, I think I went to like 4 or 5 of the rallies and events in Michigan, and since when in Michigan were we having 4 to 5 rallies in the Asian American community? I've just been blown away, and they've been, organized by all different people. Many of them, probably was their first rally that they've ever gone to. I'm really, really inspired. I think that there's a lot of folks who are standing up and speaking up. And so more events like this and giving people more direct things that they can do. Oh, one last thing is, Pollock mentioned upstanders or bystanders, and actually going back to the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, every chance I get, I keep trying to, make sure people know about the bystander intervention trainings that they're doing together with Holla Back. I was on one of them because I keep talking about them, so I figured I should be on, participate in one. And there was like 3,000 people on there. It was amazing. So we need to all get that training, because while it's us right now, and many others too that are also being targeted during this moment, we are also responsible for standing up for others. And so just encourage people to take that training. So it's great.
Yes, I actually just introduced them internally at work today as we close out API Heritage Month. At work, we had a bystander intervention training for all of our employees. And this is my second time doing it. And I remember thinking in the moment, like, there's so many things I would have thought to do kind of gutturally if I were to have witnessed someone as a victim of hate, and just thankful that I took this training, because in fact, some of those natural things that you want to do can in fact escalate the situation and not actually help the person that's being victimized. So I do encourage everyone to take it. They were offering free ones over this past month, and I'm sure there's a ton out there that you can, a ton of links out there that you can find. Going back to the question, and actually going back a little bit more back to model minority myth, just to say one last thing about that, which is that I actually think that part of the reason why we didn't see the Stop Asian Hate or these hate crimes against APIs bubble up earlier in the year, because a year ago is when I first started seeing videos pop up on my social media feeds. But I think that part of it is just mentally people associate this community with achievement, and they took each of those incidences to just be that, an incident, not a hate crime, just a one-off thing that happened to one person, nothing to do with their actual, like, not racially bent. And I just want to acknowledge that this model minority myth perpetuates its way into very different spaces, and to acknowledge it ourselves first so that we can actually recognize what is the true reason for something happening and why people aren't framing it that way. Back to what we can do to break out of the cycle, I think that the resources that people had already mentioned were great. I would just say, frankly, for me, this is, it's educational. I don't think that culturally having vulnerable conversations about how we feel and being under stress and having anxiety and going through this is necessarily natural. And maybe this is, community specific, but mental health and seeking real professional assistance is also sometimes stigmatized. That is changing as generations are getting more adept with understanding why, like, just talking things out and acknowledging what you're going through is so beneficial in the healing process. I work for a social media company. I live these, the Stop Asian Hate movement really did find itself onto social media platforms. That's how I think people were able to just raise awareness about these issues, and that it's not these one-off incidents. And I will say that you don't recognize because we're all just in front of screens all day, that this is like living through trauma. And I think some of the things that I've observed from our from the Black community and my friends and colleagues is that their experiences from this past summer what was traumatic. And when they're just opening up their, social media, they're not looking to experience that necessarily, but it's being shared everywhere. So just to acknowledge that what we're seeing on our phones, not 24 hours a day, is traumatic. I know that the hate in the US right now is targeting the East Asians, but I will say, India is going through a devastating COVID crisis right now. And we're actually seeing pretty racist policies bear from that. Obviously, there are health considerations, but at the same time, countries not allowing people from India to fly here when other countries have had similar, COVID levels in the past is rooted in some level of racism. So acknowledging that, being honest about it, calling it out, being vocal are ways that I think help us break the cycle actually, and personally help me break the kind of like overwhelming feeling of, whoa, like what can I do to change what's happening? It's not going to be me that's going to change it. It's going to be us as a collective that helps steer things to a better direction. And then the last thing that I would say is, one thing that I found, and this is having graduated now 20 plus years ago, is that the more you can engage in vulnerable, real conversations, the more you actually will learn the tools necessary to navigate through these very, very challenging times, which we can try to, there's been a rise this past year. We're going to do our best, both through formal policy making, through kind of soft power mechanisms in education, through formal education and informal education, to break these stereotypes and hopefully change the perception of APIs as foreigners and actually being deeply seated in this country. But all of that is to say, we know, I think Stephanie mentioned it, another community will be hit, there will be another new country as a new refugee class in the US, et cetera, et cetera. And now is the time to develop those skills and that resilience and those tools the best you can so that we can fight the fight going forward.
It's time to give kudos, I think, to Senator Chang for convening the group with Mike Rice, the state superintendent, to try to affect curriculum change, K-12, to add Asian American history content, and it's a laudable goal. Unfortunately, Michigan is not like California and Illinois, which have a more centralized, scheme of education. So we have to do it through the school districts. And so really, it's an opportunity for all of us to get on board with One Book, One World. That is a nationwide effort, not waiting for school districts, not waiting for states to get on board, but Asian American parents and parents generally are fundraising to get those Asian American history books into the libraries and into the schools, not waiting for the curriculum change to occur as a standard. And so really, I want to make note of that it's an effort that's happening, coast to coast. And also, there's a movement to add supplemental materials through Teach for America. If we can't get it through the school district, we can go through Teach for America and add those materials through teachers. So that's a notable effort.
So can I add just really quickly, so something that we can do in response to anti-Asian hate here on the local city council level. I introduced a mirror resolution to what Senator Stephanie Chang had introduced, which is to just condemn anti-Asian hate and harassment. I also slid in a statement on condemning white terrorism and white supremacy too, because in a city like Ann Arbor, that should be an easy yes. It was voted unanimously in support, but with a prolonged discussion on why we even have to acknowledge white supremacism and white terrorism. So I think we need to really just kind of remind ourselves that it's still a struggle to explain what white terrorism and white supremacy means, and how it's not a criticism of white allies, but it's a statement in a mirror being held up to our history and our experiences in this country. It's truth. And we should do everything to fight white supremacy and white terrorism. So in that discussion, also as a follow-up to that, it has been a closer look into what policing looks like in our local communities too. So I helped introduce a resolution on unarmed crisis response, and that's similar to what we see around the country, and making sure that when we talk about incarceration and policing, we should encourage vulnerable community members to be able to report incidences and understand that being spat upon is assault, but also really acknowledge the fears and the hesitation that minority communities face in even reporting or trusting police, depending on the experiences that they had in their home country or as a minority. It varies. And it's really up to municipalities to think more creatively about how do you connect people with services and not necessarily, incarcerate them. And if it means making sure that there's more mental health support, social service support, if, people need housing, then figure out the housing crisis. Don't criminalize people in need. And I think that's really something that our community needs to speak to. In my city council meetings, I sit in front of this poster because we're not allowed to have Zoom backgrounds, but it's a artwork by an Asian American artist from Ann Arbor. And it's across county lines and how across the county, the city has really huge gaps in life expectancy differences between the Black community and other residents. It's a 17-year gap in life expectancy. And I sit in front of this to remind folks that we have to work in service of our most vulnerable populations and not just what's most immediate. So that comes up in policing. It comes up in how do you allocate resources and budgeting. And it's part of a greater discussion on what social justice should and can look like. So I hope folks can as much as we rallied behind Congresswoman Meng's work on the COVID Hate Crime Act, I also asked folks to follow up and make sure that they also advocate for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We have to work in concert with each other if we're going to affect some change.
Thank you so much. So we're about time, but I did want to ask this one last question. And just before I do so, I just want to also plug that there is the University of Michigan Indian Advisory Board and the India Alumni Association actually have a fundraiser for a COVID relief support. I believe Carlos was going to put it up on the chat. If anyone is interested in that, please let me know. We are happy to support that. We should be supporting that. So this last question is actually I'm going to direct it first to Steph, and is that how do we as a community ensure better representation here, right? What does equitable representation look like for us?
And I just want to note there's been a couple of questions in the Q&A asking about coming together and our political beliefs and how do we make a difference that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it was referenced earlier, but the huge increase in Asian American turnout this past year shows that people are paying attention and getting more engaged. I hope that, we'll see more Asian Americans run for office. I was so happy when Lynn ran for city council. And I think, now in Michigan, we have 4 Asian Americans in the state legislature, which is amazing. But we've got to get more, and we've got to make sure that representation is at all levels. Whether it's local city councils or school boards or zoning board, all of those things really, really matter. And it's representation, not necessarily for the sake of numbers, but for really making sure that community voices are heard, and for making sure that we're affecting good policy. So, I would say that there's a number of really great training programs. I'll give a shout out to New American Leaders for their training program that I think is really good for immigrants and children of immigrants and refugees that from New American Communities that has been doing trainings for many years now. And so they're a really, really great resource, but also to, get engaged to as supporting candidates that you believe in, and also in, working on campaign teams, getting into public service in other ways as well. Because obviously it's because, we definitely want more people to run for office, also recognize that may not be the right thing for everyone. So there's so many ways to be engaged, and I'll put my contact info in the chat and would be happy to connect with folks after too.
And I just have one last follow-up question for the rest of the panelists too. Besides looking at just, from a government perspective, what else does representation look like for us, right? And I say that because, I'm also thinking from that Asian side of that, there's people who can't vote. It's not that they're not interested in the politics of things, but what about what's happening in Hollywood, or what's just in general, that the reaction to the recent survey that 42% of Americans could not name a single prominent Asian American or Asian, or, that is here in the States. So I was just wondering if anyone had any last comments for that to close out on that.
I think they need to listen to Linda's.
That's a good one.
Yeah, they're amazing. Someone called them Rage Against the Racist Kings or something like that. I thought that was great. I definitely interpreted this question a little bit more broadly. I obviously am now working in tech, but prior to this, I was a public interest lawyer for 12 years. And I remember one of the effective ways to get more Asians in higher roles in law firms and also in judgeships was like these tactful call to actions. So we would ask for general counsels there were oftentimes like, either general counsels or sometimes CEOs of companies that were Asian, and that they would not only want someone to be an API person from the law firm that they were going to give money to represent them, but make sure that API person was actually the one leading the case or leading the effort, that we rallied behind APIs that were looking to become judges, or frankly, because maybe some of us are from newer generations and we haven't seen ourselves represented on the bench, to actually tap more Asians to make sure that they realize that this is an incredible way to have impact in your local community. When it comes to representation, in a tech company, I sometimes like to say that almost 45% of tech, at least some of the major tech companies, Facebook included, Google likely, and Apple are of Asian and Asian Pacific Islander people, right? Employees in these companies. And yet we haven't seen these companies step up nearly to the extent that they should have in the aftermath of all of this rise in Asian hate. And I think one of the things that we often talk about internally is that while we make up almost 50% in some instances of these companies, we are not seeing ourselves represented in higher levels of leadership. And often that is because of lack of training in terms of self-advocacy and the real expectation around advocating for what you want, and just being able to make sure that we're doing that mentoring within the community so that people realize the way to navigate to these places. I know that there are other, you had mentioned Hollywood, and I think we can all say that supporting creators, supporting content, supporting artists, when things are produced, when things are authored, is a huge signal to these companies that are sometimes looking for the bottom line, that there is a demand out there for storytelling of these cultures and these communities. So I think where we can support each other's books that are being written and trying to make sure we're all buying tickets to go see the movies and things like that, we will see more of our stories being told in those places.
Great. Thank you so much. And just to note that we also, I believe there are two attendees who have podcasts that just made Michigan alumni, Asian American, who made the Forbes 5 list of like podcasts that you should listen to for Asians. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. But that being said, thank you so much. And Roland, did you have any final words on this before I just wrap up everybody?
Well, I think we need to urge people to run for office if they are inclined. If they're not inclined, they should contribute to people of their choice. And if they're not going to do that, they should seek, boards and committees, that sort of thing. There's always an opportunity to be active and to represent whatever's of interest to you. and serve the community in that sense at whatever level you're comfortable doing.
Great.
Can I add also, to encourage our creative artists in our community to help tell our stories? We need to be part of the creative space. We don't have to wait for a Hollywood hit, to be represented. There are folks, I've told my story on Moth Radio Hour a couple of years ago. I didn't know you had to actually, that you couldn't read your story off your phone. So just prepared if you do Moth to do that. But I think a lot of us are reluctant to share our stories. And if we share just the richness of our community and the arts, I think would really help us. I think it would help give people a different frames of reference besides the easies of, food and, stereotypes.
Well, with that, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. Palak, Roland, Lynn, Stephanie, and of course, Congresswoman Meng, who left a little earlier. I do want to also thank everyone for attending and making this event so successful. This event has been recorded, so you will all get a email tomorrow with the link of the recording. I urge you all to please share this. This topic is endless. We could have probably had hours and hours of this conversation. I hope to continue as part of our education programs and our programming to have this. I'm actually working with, hopefully with Dr. Melissa Borja on the Black Alumni group to have a next panel about solidarity. And she was actually the person who led that study that Jen had just talked about. And so again, I'm going to plea again, we're a brand new group. We need volunteers to help us run these committees. The committee chairs cannot do it themselves. The board cannot do it themselves. We need that representation. We need, and so please feel free to email me at umishaapi@gmail. If you're interested in volunteering, we'll have a volunteer call for action for volunteers coming soon. And stay connected with us on Instagram, Facebook, everything's listed there. And we also have a website. Thank you so much for joining us and really appreciate you all making this annual event, our first one, so special. Thank you so much.